Welcome to episode 63 of the Clear Path Pod. Today is our Warriors season preview. The Warriors, a lot of new additions to the offseason, a new competitive Western Conference, Chris Paul, Dario Saric, Corey Joseph, a whole host of other interesting players on the team. Disappointing end to last season, but after a dramatic 2022, 2023, I think this season can only be better than last year. And we're here today to preview that season for you. We're going to talk about all of the changes made during the offseason. We're going to talk about preseason game 1. The Warriors won against the Lakers last night. And we're just going to preview also how we project the season to go against a competitive Western Conference, how our starters, second unit stacks up, and everything else about the Warriors as we start the quest for title number 5. Okay, so last night the Warriors played the Los Angeles Lakers in preseason game number 1. Obviously, it's preseason. Just because the Warriors beat the Lakers doesn't really mean anything. It's more about what you saw from the individual players. More importantly, it's more about what sets we ran, how players looked working together. And I think that there was a lot to pull from. I'm going to start with the biggest offseason addition that we made, Chris Paul.
Great place to start.
So I think we can talk about what we saw during the game, and I also want to loop this in with just in general what we're getting with Chris Paul. Chris Paul, old, very experienced point guard, one of the best pick-and-roll ball handlers in league history, one of the best point guards of all time. Warriors rival for many years, now joins the Warriors. Based on what you saw last night and what you projected for the season, what did you think of the CP3 debut, and what do you think it's going to be like this year?
Wow, CP3 was a welcome new addition for me. Just in terms of, if any of you guys are like basketball people, I'd say me and Jeff are we like basketball, but anybody who is really fundamental about the game and really wants the game to be played correctly, I feel like really loved Chris Paul. It reminded me kind of that. I was watching a clip this weekend where there was just it's like what Steph Curry has done to high school basketball, and it was 15 people shooting from half court, and it would just they would just make it, and then they'd make it, and then they'd make it. Except with us, it used to be Jordan Poole would just miss it, and then miss it, and then miss it, and it'd just be what are we doing? When are we going to get back into the flow of the game? And Chris Paul really helps us get away from just throwing up threes, and I feel there was a really critical point. I think it was about 5-6 minutes left in the first quarter when Klay Thompson was just shooting everything that could hit his hands, just trying to get hot, which, understandable, preseason game, whatever. Yeah. But CP3 clearly took the ball in his hands and tried to get him an actual look, tried to facilitate an actual offense, which I felt was something that I sorely missed personally. So I really welcomed his addition, and I thought that looked well on the flow of the offense. And he actually gets us into sets pretty well, which was helpful.
Yeah, let's discuss that more, because I think that the biggest impact that CP3 is going to have on the Warriors is how he changes the makeup of the offense. The Warriors are a motion offense. Their whole flow and the whole uniqueness behind watching the Warriors has been watching them play with this unique set of guard-to-guard screens, of big men who can pass, DHO, obviously, with shooters who can run off of screens. It's tons of motion, and the result of that is that it's not a lot of ball screens. The Warriors were second last in the league last year in terms of the number of pick and rolls ran. Chris Paul and the Suns were, I believe, 5th highest in the league for pick and rolls ran. And this is a interesting statistic. Chris Paul himself was involved in half of the total. So the Warriors ran about 2,000 ball screens last year. Chris Paul ran 1,000 by himself, which shows you that Chris Paul is there to change the makeup of the Warriors offense. Now, when I say that, I don't mean that the Warriors are going to change everything, eschew the motion offense, it's all ball screens. What I'm saying is that Chris Paul is maybe, the most experienced pick and roll ball handler in the NBA. And because of that, it would make absolutely no sense to not take advantage of that at least a little bit. And that's exactly what the Warriors did yesterday. And it's not just ball screens, right? The Warriors also,
Yeah.
get into other actions that we'll discuss later on. But specifically with just changing the identity of their offense, you could see how Chris Paul is like this new part of the system that now Steph Curry has yet another multi-dimensional, dynamic guard to run screens with. We saw Chris Paul and Steph run a lot of side actions, not specifically pick and roll, but pistol actions on the side yesterday. Chris Paul helping get Steph either downhill or up screens into open shots. I think that in itself is really unique. It's not something that Steph has had necessarily. He had JP, but JP isn't even close to the same level of pick and roll ball handler or passer as Chris Paul. And I think that last night we saw that work in a really interesting way. I think defensively, in terms of like who guards those types of actions, the Warriors could run trouble. But it was really nice to see. Did you see anything in particular from Chris Paul and like Steph and Clay last night?
Well, I think just the kind of earlier point, I felt like with Clay being more open on shots and kind of getting into sets to get him open, I thought that was super important for the game. Not for winning, but just for like the future of kind of the partnership. I feel like Clay is going to need his shots, and Chris Paul facilitating early, I think, really sets up this team well.
Right, yeah. I mean, Chris Paul, amazing introduction into this offense, because I think what you're saying is last year with Jordan Poole is a highly, volatile, high ceiling offensive output, not very efficient sometimes makes poor choices, sometimes doesn't make the right reads. Chris Paul, doesn't have as high of a ceiling anymore, but much better at making the correct reads and pick and roll, more disciplined and more experienced, and as a result, if he sees someone having a bad night or recognizes, a gap in the defense, that's something he can take advantage of. Something else I wanted to touch on was Chris Paul working with other assets on the team, right? We've added a lot of new players this year. We've also, this is our third year of seeing Jonathan Kuminga trying to see if he can grow.
Yeah.
How do you think across the season and also last night, how do you think Chris Paul works with that second unit and with like Steph, Clay, Dre players?
I thought that Kuminga worked great. I thought you could clearly see, I mean, we could do like a whole segment about this, but just to like hit on some of the highlights, I felt like he operated more calmly than I feel like he ever has in like the regular season, even coming from last year. And he is more than just like, he had that like highlight reel dunk, but he's more than that now. He's clearly a player that has kind of intelligence with the ball in his hand and has the ability to shoot. Like, maybe he's not the best shooter in the world, although last year's stats would tell you otherwise. Like, I mean, he ended up shooting around 40% from three in like the last like 20 or so games. Obviously on low attempts, but you're not expecting him to have high attempts, and nobody's really putting up their hand when he's trying to shoot. So I think it's really
wide open.
Yeah, exactly. And it's just he's able to get off his shots, and that's the most important thing. And I feel like the evolution I've seen this year specifically is that he is a better facilitator, and he's starting to like run the offense, like actually like hold the ball at the top of the key, like tell Moses Moody to do certain things, give it to him in the post, run the Warriors offense through the post, which is something that I think is really important, because the Warriors like to run a lot of their offense through the post in terms of giving it to Draymond Green and then having him pass out from there, do dribble handoffs. And Jonathan Kuminga doing a dribble handoff sounds really scary just because of the space it could create and the lobs that they could throw to him potentially in the regular season and just kind of abuse bigs.
Yeah, one of JK's problems last season was making really poor decisions, especially off passes, whether that's as a roll man or, in like middle to end of possession scenarios. JK turned the ball over a lot. On top of that, I think that clearly the decision making wasn't there last season.
Yeah.
We don't know if it's going to be there this year. It looks like after one preseason game that maybe he's a little more polished. At least he was last night. There's been a lot of reports this offseason about him, improving. He grew an inch or something. But I think that it'll take some time for us to see how confidence, better decision making can flow into him hopefully seeing a bigger role. I think Chris Paul can only really help Kuminga because I think that JK has always sort of been hurt by the way the motion offense runs because it's very cerebral. It requires you to be in the right place at the right time,
Yeah.
seeing the screens set, seeing the gaps, seeing a chance to get Steph open. These are all things that the veterans of the Warriors past have been really great at doing, and it's something that JK, as a 21-year-old player, straight from G League Ignite, hasn't been as good at the last few years. But I think having Chris Paul reduces that load on him, and also now we have one of the most experienced guards in the league that can help create opportunities for JK, because now, hopefully that downhill threat can be, I guess, better utilized by a point guard like Chris Paul.
Yeah, I think the question you have to ask yourself too is the Warriors, and we have to be faced with this fact, the Warriors aren't really that great at developing young prospects like Kuminga and like into the players that are going to win now. They're really good at developing guard players, but in terms of bigs, Draymond Green is really their best guy. Even Looney, I mean, did he really develop into what they thought he would? Probably not. I mean, Looney never played like this ever in his entire life until he came to, like, after 4 years with the Warriors. So on such an old team, mentoring Kuminga is really tough. He just doesn't get the minutes to play. So for all those people that are saying, like, oh, but it's 3 years in, he should have already shown it, like, he's not going to be any good. I think this is a very unique situation where the Warriors need everyone to be like mentally locked in, and they don't give a chance for you to make mistakes. And so I think this year is the year that is kind of boom or bust for Kuminga, honestly, where does he get it or does he not? And if he doesn't get it,
Right.
if we're going to continue with the Curry timeline, we should probably trade him away.
Right. I think last season we had this two timelines approach. Everyone thought it would work at the start of the season. I think the problem is that what it sacrificed was more experienced players that knew and were specifically tuned to bolster, Steph's offense, and that kind of got changed last year into players in the, back end of the rotation within the second unit also that weren't necessarily tuned for that Steph, Clay, and Dre core.
Yeah.
And this year, I think Kuminga's role shifts yet again to someone who is hopefully advantaged to bolster that, because after all, every year it's been this way since 2009, but I guess 2014 when they won the title. Every year, what's the key? The key is Steph Curry, and the key is how do we build players around Steph Curry that work well. And JK can do that. He hasn't in years past, primarily because his lack of good decision making, high turnovers, limited floor spacing asset has meant that he couldn't see the floor. And I hope that not only did he personally develop this year, but also that our additions like Chris Paul can help make that happen. Is there anything else last night in the preseason game that you want to discuss that you thought was interesting?
Yeah, I really wanted to discuss Saric before we moved on. I thought he was really interesting in the Warriors offense. I thought he really provided a different element. I think they even noticed it on the broadcast a little bit, saying like, oh, now you can't just sag off of him and sit in the lane because there's Saric out there from three. And I was just thinking about, like, what if that's Brook Lopez or somebody like an actual good NBA center instead of, like, Christian Wood, who is not that great at defense. But that's for another day. But still, like, Lopez being in the paint is so much more for the Warriors to worry about when driving to the rim than him getting pulled outside and being able to actually drive to the rim, get rim attempts. So I feel like the general theme of, and why Saric I think fits well, talking about him with CP3, is because they give us new elements we didn't have before. We didn't have a five that could really shoot threes that well. We didn't have a mid-range player, and Chris Paul provides the mid-range. Saric provides the three-point shot,
Yeah.
and so I think that's really just a new dimension, and I really like that for the team.
Yeah, 6'10", really useful stretch four, situational five. He shot 39% from three last season, 36% in his career. I think of him like I think if you look at the long line of Warriors stretch fours slash situational fives that they've had, like last year, JaMychal Green, OPJ. OPJ wasn't really a five, obviously, but stretch type a four, right? You think of players like that, Nemanja Bjelica. Every year, these players have different upsides, and I think last year we saw that the upside of JaMychal Green was arguably physicality in the interior, but that didn't really materialize because JaMychal Green, I don't know whether he lost a step or he lost strength, but he clearly wasn't able to
He had that leg infection
be that
too.
much of an interior presence. Right. And then we saw the year before that, okay, OPJ doesn't provide the same physicality that JMG does, but OPJ
No.
can stretch the floor. He's a much better shot creator, and he's a long, more nimble forward in that wing in that position.
Yeah.
And I think that Saric provides a player closer to that OPJ threat, but also is just larger. I already mentioned his shooting percentage. He's a really good three-point shooter that creates so many more spacing opportunities for the Warriors. And uniquely, and we saw some of this last night, and I think we'll continue to see more of it as the season progresses, he's one of the best screen setters and pick-and-roll passers that the Warriors have had at that position in a long time. If you remember, not many people probably watched his play the last few years, but if you watched him in OKC, if you watched him in Phoenix, he definitely is capable of making really high-level reads. He's a really good short roll passer, and I think that should really benefit the Warriors because they already have some of that with like Draymond Green, right?
Yeah.
So I think Saric provides a much higher offensive floor than JaMychal Green did. I think that was not something like, I wouldn't say that like was the reason the Warriors didn't do well last season, but I would say that JaMychal Green was definitely like a negative asset last year.
Yeah, for sure.
And Saric, hopefully with just shooting ability alone, should nullify that.
Yeah, I agree with that. I don't really have anything to say regarding it. I think you hit the nail on the head. It's just he's going to be a great shooter for us and give us a different element, which is important after we lost Otto Porter Jr., I feel like.
Yeah, definitely. Not a great not a great defender for being 6'10", not a great rim protector, not as good of a post-up defender. Bjelica was better. OPJ arguably was better on the wings, but I think the Warriors will live with having that shooting option, having that playmaking option, especially as a big. And they got him at a pretty good price. I don't know exactly what the contract is, but the deal...
It's a vet minimum.
Bad.
Basically.
Okay, so good 1-year deal for Saric. I think that if the Warriors do well this season, it will be, at least in part, be because Saric was a great asset to add.
Yeah. And just quickly, I don't really know if we don't have this in the notes or anything, but do you think the Warriors starting five is going to look the same as it did last night?
I mean, when Draymond Green returned, no. I mean, I don't think the Warriors can afford to not have...
No, I just mean like while Draymond Green's out. You think we'll start with that?
Oh. I believe so. I mean, I don't know what else we would change. Is there?
I think you could potentially start like Kuminga in a role, but it just depends. You could start Kuminga instead of Looney, or
right. I think it's possible. I don't know.
Probably not Kuminga instead of Looney. You could start Kuminga instead of I mean, you'd honestly want to take maybe Clay or but Wiggins is too good, so
it's not happening.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think the starting lineup right now is the best of both worlds. I could maybe see, like, if Chris Paul wasn't playing, at least training camp, playing so well, gelling so well, I think maybe you could see something being swapped out with CP3, but I doubt it. I expect this starting five to stick until Draymond comes back, and then we'll see what happens with Coach Kerr. Before we get out of this preseason discussion, there's one other really interesting asset that I want to discuss That's Brandon Pajemski.
Yeah,
Pajemski is how
he
you
was
say it, I
interesting.
believe. We're just going to call him Pods this year, so I don't have to say that every time. Pods, really, really interesting performance yesterday. Displayed a pretty like bursty guard performance, I would say.
Yeah,
Um, Based on, you know, caveat, just a preseason game. It's not like the Lakers are trotting out their best, lineups, the best effort. Same with the Warriors. But what did you think of Pods? And do you think that there is a chance there, or do you think that he's going to kind of recede back into, you know, someone that gets more of like a Santa Cruz stint?
I could see him getting a Santa Cruz stint. I think almost certainly he gets a Santa Cruz stint, actually. Just with the way the Warriors do player development, if he doesn't play like over 20 minutes a night, they'll definitely send him down. So, yes, to the Santa Cruz. What do I think about him? Brandon looks like a mini Russ who left like half of his athletic abilities behind. Like he does a lot of really scrappy like fighting things. Like if you notice, he'll always have like way more rebounds than you think he should have. He's always demanding the ball. There was like a play where like he was open in the corner and Kuminga didn't pass it to him. He like shot a three instead, and Brandon was just like, "Give me the ball! Like I want the ball!" And it's like he has a lot of fire and really has the wherewithal to like he really wants it bad, and he's clearly been working on stuff. What you notice is he's really crafty. I feel like that's his best trait because he's not more athletically lifted than anybody on the court. He's not faster. He's not taller. He's not like more skilled necessarily. But like he had this little hook shot in the lane where he like goes up like just while the defender's jumping. He's not going to get it over them, so instead he like hooks it over with his left hand, and that's like a little crafty shot that clearly he's been developing, and he's been just trying to find new ways to get it in the hoop, and I like that kind of attitude. I mean, it's really good. It's really scrappy for like a bench guy. I think he'll probably be like the backup point guard because we just have so
Right.
many like people who could play the
Behind
point.
Kojo, probably. Yeah.
Well, maybe ahead of Kojo, but just like we have Chris Paul and we have Steph Curry, and then like last night showed me that Moody can kind of play the point as well, and they might want him to do that. So then it's like he'd be after that, but he has a potential to like really be a pretty good point guard and I think a good shooter.
Yeah, I think part of the allure of Pods coming into the season, around draft time especially, was just watching his really crafty moves in the interior, watching his speed with the ball, watching his unique finishing ability, and I think that, yeah, I like that the Warriors have found yet another player like, I mean, not, I don't know if it's to the level of Jordan Poole, but another player who has really crafty dribble moves and can get into the interior space, and collapse the defense. Now, like I said, it's not like he's playing, like a starting caliber defense last night.
Yeah.
But as someone that could potentially play in the second unit, in non-Steph, non-CP3, or maybe even with CP3 minutes, I do think that Pods has potential, and I would love to see him play more against second units, because I think something that was, maybe it wasn't underrated with Jordan Poole, but something that was really awesome about JP was that he was really, really gifted, sometimes when he wasn't making poor decisions, in really crafty dribble moves, being able to weave his way into the interior, being really hard to defend, just one-on-one point of attack. And I hope that Pods can provide some sort of, gravity like that. Although, remains to be seen. There's a lot more we're going to have to see from Pods before we crown him.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's just the preseason. We haven't seen him play a regular season NBA game yet, so let's wait. Pump the brakes, as they say.
Okay, so that was our brief coverage of preseason game 1. We talked a bit about CP3, a bit about Saric, a bit about some of the young guns. I want to go back to them, though, because I think that, and when I mention the young guns, I'm specifically talking about Jonathan Kuminga and Moses Moody. Two interesting playoff assets, or excuse me, not playoff assets that the Warriors added, 2 years ago. Neither of them have really blossomed into what Warriors fans have hoped, at least. Moses Moody had a good stint in last year's playoffs, actually played more minutes than Jonathan Kuminga. JK has always looked really athletic, has always had highlight reel plays, has shown he can leap out of the gym, but as I said, makes poor decisions sometimes, turns the ball over,
Yeah.
isn't a reliable floor spacer, so he hasn't seen much time. Based on this, and based on all of the things that I'm sure you've read on Twitter, Kuminga Muse, all of the fun Warriors Twitter accounts, let's start with JK. Do you think that Kuminga's going to blossom this season? What are you expecting?
Yeah, I think Kuminga's going to break out this season. I think his increase in height, his defensive versatility, he started to showcase last season, later in the season, and specifically, I think this is something that people are flying under the radar. The fact that Joe Lacob mentioned that everyone came into shape into camp, and that's something that last year Kuminga didn't do. He wasn't in the best of shape just because he went home to see his family and everything like that, and that caused him to be out of shape, whereas this summer, he'd been working really hard in the offseason, and I feel like after the championship also, players kind of relaxed. I feel like this season we get a whole new kind of refreshed start where Kuminga is really gone and taking his game to the next level. I think, like, from the visual perspective, I've noticed an improvement in his game, and so I'm really happy to see that. And I think even just a little bit more on the discipline part, that will go such a long way to him playing heavy minutes.
Discipline is huge. Discipline is huge. How tall is he now?
I think people say he's like 6'7", 6'8", like between that. People say he's like around Wiggins' height, like maybe a little shorter than Wiggins, but around that height. And he's shorter than like 7 feet, obviously. But some people say he's 7 feet, but he's not 7 feet.
Yeah, I don't know if the Warriors have had a player that's really grown significantly in the offseason in years past. An inch is a significant amount. I think something I saw a bit of last night was some more fun developed post moves. I think that could come into handy.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's watching JK play the interior has always been fun, just because a talent, I guess, I don't know, a gift of God that you get when you're that athletic is like the ability to basically leap off the ground when you're just flat-footed, which is really useful, especially when you're in like those rebound situations and you grab the low rebound and you want to get up, get fouled, or just get a putback bucket. So if Jonathan Kuminga has some more developed skills, whether that's because he grew or because he's been working on it in the offseason, I think that's really useful, because I think what has been shown in last year's playoffs especially was that it's mainly the Kings series, is that it's really useful for the Warriors to have someone who can butt heads with like a Giannis type big, right? Because those guys are pretty hard to contest with inside, but we saw Looney have a lot of success battling in the interior last series against the Kings. Hopefully Kuminga can provide that sort of option. I think everyone remembers the Alex Len minutes last year that gave the Warriors a lot of problems, so
yeah,
I think that's why all of the fans and media want the Warriors to have bigs, is because of like Len, but also obviously like Anthony Davis, players like that. And I hope Kuminga can provide some more interesting pieces, especially on the defensive end. Let's move on to Moody. Mm-hmm. Moody's always been interesting. In terms of my personal opinion of him, he seems like a guy who gets the basics. He has a good shot. He knows how to play make. I wouldn't say dribble moves are his talent or anything, but he's always been a more developed. Right. He's always had more developed reads, it looked like, than Jonathan Kuminga had, even than Jordan Poole had in some situations. What do you expect this season? Do you think that playoff Moody means that there's some improvement coming, or do you think that we're kind of reaching the ceiling?
I mean, I don't want to put a ceiling on a third-year player who barely plays, Like,
right.
I think Moody last year in the playoffs did unlock something for Steve Kerr where he's going to try hard defensively. He's gonna try and score the ball and facilitate the offense in the way it's supposed to be done. Does he have the talent of a Steph Curry? No, he doesn't. That we know for sure. He doesn't have that type of talent. Can he be a spot up shooter? Absolutely. Like, I think what I'd like to compare him to is just like, honestly, a more souped up Damian Lee. That's what I feel like he is. Like, he can dribble better, he can facilitate better, he can defend better. But really, his role is very similar. Like, basically, a starting lineup Damian Lee, I feel like, is what he is. Like, he can spot up, he can defend well, but he's not also afraid to get into the mix in the lane. He has some pretty crafty moves, but there's not, like,
Right.
Podziemski's moves or anything like that. But he's definitely, I think, earned Steve Kerr's trust, which is honestly one of the hardest things for young players to get, it seems like, in the Warriors, so I think he'll definitely start playing. I'd see him as like a 7th, 8th man, I feel like, in the rotation. But as our like 6th man, I think Kuminga is going to get that spot when we start out until he fails, kind of. And if he does, I think, like, obviously Moody will probably take that spot. But for now, I think Kuminga and Moody are like kind of the first people off the bench.
Yeah, I agree with you. I personally am a bit more cynical about the potential of the young guns. I think that last season I was willing to give it the benefit of the doubt. This year, I think we'll give it one more shot, like you said, and then if nothing materializes, not that Dunleavy and Bob Myers haven't already used Kuminga as like trade bait, maybe not trade bait, as a trade asset.
Yeah.
But I think the Warriors might begin to explore that a lot more heavily. I honestly, I wouldn't be surprised if before the trade deadline, Dunleavy continues to explore that with Jonathan Kuminga.
Yeah, absolutely.
There's been talk of there's been talk of like OG Anunoby type guys.
Yeah.
And I think that is an asset that the Warriors need. Now, if Kuminga can display that type of wing defensive ability, then, maybe we can reconsider. But we're going to need some more games. So far, looks good in the preseason. We'll see next Friday as they play the Lakers yet again. Hopefully he can get some more run.
Yeah.
Okay, so finally, we've discussed some of the young players. We've discussed Dario Saric. We've discussed a little bit about Chris Paul. Let's move on to talking about the Western Conference and, the Warriors in general. Let's talk about the big boys on the Warriors, the core, the starters, and how we project this season to go. So, first thing that I want to ask you about is size. The Warriors got burned by size and physicality in last year's playoff series against the Lakers.
Yeah.
In part against the Kings. My question to you is, have they addressed that issue at all? And if they haven't addressed it by personnel, do you think that remains an issue for them coming into this season?
Do I think it remains an issue for them coming into this season? I think it's still an issue. I think the Warriors, though, it's always an issue. I think everyone tells them to get size. They don't get size, and then they win a championship. It's always been that type of thing, I feel like. So I just want to stress to people that we will be small all year. We will get bullied inside all year. Where we make our advantage is we don't play people who, have a lot of size, but we play people who are supposed to be skilled in terms of shooting threes, and that's how we're going to win games. I think that Saric does add some size for when we absolutely need just size. But Draymond Green has been one of the best big defenders ever, and so I think people are always just like, oh yeah, we need size, but like realistically, in the playoffs, it could be helpful to have somebody for like a couple minutes, and maybe that's like Dwight Howard later in the season or something like that. But
Right.
For most of the minutes, we're gonna have Looney and Draymond out there, so I'm not too worried, honestly.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're spot on there with the Draymond thing. We haven't played someone yet like Giannis. I mean, we did play AD. I think AD is a bit different, but Draymond has been able to defend bigs at a level that, no player Draymond size has ever been able to do, right? I think people might forget last year not last season, the season before when the Warriors won the title, when Draymond gave Jokic a lot of problems in the interior. Sure, Jokic still scores a lot. He's crafty. He's maybe the best player in the NBA. We understand that. But Draymond Green is able to handle a lot of these bigs with a lot of really awesome technique, with a lot of really awesome skills, and really stout size. Draymond is really good in that mid-post area, even against players who are 7 feet tall that have awesome scoring abilities. Don't underestimate Draymond. Don't underestimate Looney, who, if everyone remembers, I mean, I would say basically shut down Domantas Sabonis in last year's series against the Kings. That's Kevon Looney, right? Kevon Looney shut down Sabonis, and I think that you're right. The Warriors did not address their size issues. They didn't really even address their wing defense issues. But I think that if the Warriors can create a high-powered offense like they have in years past and still have a decent second unit, which they did not have last season, size might not be an issue. Something that I mean, I don't know if it's possible to have like an educated opinion on this. It's sort of intangible, but last season the Warriors had one of the worst road defenses in the entire league. Do you think that they've like fixed that this year? Do you think that that was a chemistry issue? I mean, what do you think caused that, and do you think that's something that they can fix this year?
For me, I think it's something that can be fixed because now they really have like an old core, and I feel like they have old souls, and they're really in that young kind of mentoring relationship. It feels like with Kuminga and Moody, and they're the type of kids who I feel like have listened to them and will listen to them. Whereas Jordan Poole, I feel like last year felt like, hey, I got my bag, like I need to show my worth, and he stopped playing fundamental basketball and started playing flashy basketball because he knew he had like the contract and everything like that. And so I think like the Warriors know that now, and so they're going to like promote that kind of culture. And I feel like also their sixth man being a defensive guy is so much more important. Like when we won the championship, Otto Porter Jr. was essentially like our sixth man for a large portion of the year, or Kuminga, or like Bielitsa, people like that came in and had an instant defensive impact as well because they were good defenders. But when we put in Jordan Poole, we're just getting an offensive boost, but we're never having that like defensive presence, which is why it was so hit or miss with him. Our plus minus numbers with Steph Curry on off were like crazy throughout the season if you just looked, and in the playoffs he was on a downswing, so our numbers were terrible. And that's when I feel like having somebody like Kuminga or Moody as our like sixth man can really help.
Yeah, I think that as someone who's not in the locker room, I don't think anyone who isn't in the organization would actually know, but it seems like part of the issue with the road defense was locker room chemistry, personnel, and then maybe motivation. I don't want to make claims on something that I can't really prove. I think that this year, even though it's largely the same defensive personnel, I do hope that there is a restored chemistry and restored trust, because I think last season part of the problem was that the Warriors defense has always been based on trust, on allowing players like Draymond, who are extremely gifted in closeouts, to be able to save possessions, to be able to close out to weak side, strong side shooters. And last year, for whatever reason, that trust wasn't there. When the Warriors were getting put in rotation because of passing, floor spacing, they were often getting burned. A lot of times because of guys like Jordan Poole, but also players like, Steph. Steph had plenty of issues like that last year as well with Draymond. So I think that hopefully will improve this season, because I think that the delta between home and road defense last year, even though the Warriors were one of the best home defenses, I mean, when you're that weak on the road, like not only is it just a bad reflection on your team, but it puts you in a really tough spot in terms of your record.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's close this by talking a bit about the Western Conference, a bit about the Warriors' core, and how we expect them to do. So, for the past 2 years, the Warriors starting five, so that's Steph, Clay, Dre, Looney, and Wiggins, has been the best in terms of plus minus efficiency, et cetera, et cetera. The best 5-man starting unit in the NBA. And personally, I think that can continue. My question to you is, do you think that that will, remain? I mean, do you think that can persist against, year two of the Kings' high octane offense, against the Lakers with their new, their new wings, their new depth, against the Timberwolves, who everyone's projecting to have a very good season, against the Nuggets? How do you think the Warriors are going to stack up?
I think they'll stack up right at the top. I think that's a really good unit. It's really well balanced, and I just don't know how you're gonna it's just such a tough unit to break. Even in the playoffs versus the Lakers, they still had really great minutes with that unit on the floor. So it just feels like that unit is just really good, and I think Chris Paul and Kuminga can be great additions to that unit to kind of give us a strong 7. Because what people don't realize is in the playoffs, you need 7 or 8 players. That's really all you need. You need 7 or 8 players that make big impacts on the game. And so who is that? Now we have 6. And realistically, we want another one because Chris Paul is an injury-prone guy. So we want someone else that's going to make big impacts. And so for us, we have to find that for the rest of the season. Is that going to be Saric, Kuminga, Moody? Is it going to be Pajemski, Saric, Kuminga? Who knows? We just have to see. And that's kind of what I feel like we're waiting for our bench. But I think that unit you talked about, that 5-man lineup, is still going to be one of the top units in the league.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think that even though there has been more depth added to some of the other contenders, I don't see a team in the West that looks impossible to deal with. I think that in years past, the Warriors have looked at teams like Milwaukee, for example, as whenever we play them, there's just this looming problem that the Warriors have no answer to, that being Giannis, that being the floor spacing. I don't see that in the West as much this year. I see more competitiveness, but I don't see a looming destructive super team. Speaking of super team, though, Phoenix Suns, do you? Because I think that's the only one in the West that you would look at as a ultra high powered offense. What do you think of that matchup? Do you think the Warriors?
Oh, the Warriors match up favorably, I think, with them.
Why is that?
I just think because we have we have the wing defenders. That's probably one of our stronger positions, and specifically big wings are something that Draymond Green is a really good defender for. He's perfect for that. For somebody like Kevin Durant, I feel like we haven't gotten to see that matchup a lot, but that is a really good matchup. And I think that Bradley Beal on in that team will not be nearly as big of a threat, and I feel like Klay Thompson is a perfect matchup for him. Devin Booker is going to go off sometimes, that's just going to be how it is, but that team struggles on the defensive end, and I feel like they don't really have a defender that's going to be good at guarding Steph around screens unless they just keep Josh Okogie out there, but then their offense suffers a lot, so then it's it creates problems for them, and they don't really have a point guard when he's out there too, unless Devin Booker runs the point, and they face a problem. And then also getting rid of DeAndre Ayton makes it so that if we put out somebody who can just bully or be a presence at the rim, we have the advantage there too. And Yusuf Nurkic ain't no rim protector. He is literally an offensive guy. So he's like a Christian Wood, but a little better and always injured. So I feel like we have a good chance against the Phoenix Suns. I actually feel like I would be very confident in both that matchup, and I feel like the Denver matchup, the Warriors bring something different. I think the Lakers are actually a harder matchup for the Warriors.
Absolutely. We didn't get to talk too much about this as the Warriors faded out of the playoffs last year, and we didn't discuss too much about their potential. But I do think that and again, I'm not saying the Warriors would have beat the Nuggets.
No, they probably wouldn't have. But
anything could have happened. But the Warriors' matchup against the Nuggets is far better, in my opinion, than almost any other team. And that primarily happened in the playoffs 2 years ago through the Warriors deciding to run Jokic through the Steph ball ringer. To recap, what happened was the Warriors would set super high ball screens against Jokic. Maybe it was with Kevin Looney, Draymond Green, where you're bringing Jokic, you're forcing him to come meet you up very high
Yeah.
because the threat at ball screen is a Steph Curry, wide open three. So whenever you bring Jokic up that high, what happens is that Steph has so much downhill space to create really easy opportunities at the rim to distribute, and he's Steph, so he can still get open threes or Steph open threes off those opportunities. And I think that punching that ball screen button, which is what the Warriors did against the Kings whenever Steph dropped 50, is definitely an advantage that they have and something that will help them against teams that lean on bigs who are not necessarily or who are defensive liabilities. And I think that the Nuggets would definitely qualify as that. And I mean, I think the Suns would too, right? Like, I don't think that Devin Booker and Bradley Beal are nearly the type of asset that would work well in these defensive scenarios.
Absolutely, and that's where we can take advantage of them. The thing about the starting lineup is that it has a great mix of defense and offense, and that's what I think. If we can get outscored, but we will hopefully outscore you. Like if you put up 110, we'll put up 120. But there might be some games where, the Warriors are so good on defense that, they'll put up 80, but we might not be as good of a matchup like the Lakers where we get into like a slog fest and it's just like a 90-90 game type thing. Which is why I feel like this starting lineup could be one of the best. The only one that I think could compete, honestly, is going to be the Bucks starting lineup with Giannis and Dame coming out there with Middleton and Brook Lopez. That's going to be really tough for us to beat, but they don't have nearly the depth that we do in terms of that fifth man. So,
yeah, I think depth is something that the Warriors hopefully this year have more of. I think our second unit should be far better. I mean, if we just compare that to what the Warriors were running with last season, there were quite a few opportunities with, I think if maybe you could help me out here, just remember some of the second units that we had last year. We were running like Wiseman, Jordan Poole, Moses Moody,
all young players essentially, and they're older now, and they just weren't as polished, and we couldn't rely on them for really spot minutes. They'd be up and down, so they didn't know their role.
Even those lineups that had assets like Dante DiVincenzo, right? Great point of attack defender, great defender for his size. Those types of lineups were still getting, destroyed defensively, and were not able to create cohesive opportunities because JP is not the best runner of like this second unit where you have to play kind of conservatively. This season, I think that the Warriors should have a much, much, much better chance with Chris Paul manning that unit to at least stay level in non-Steph minutes.
Yeah, and Dante DiVincenzo was a great pickup, but we just didn't have enough in kind of the parts that we needed in terms of the wing position and the big position. I felt like.
Yeah, definitely. I think the Warriors definitely miss him in particular on the defensive end, but I think that GP2 can still plug that hole, right?
Yeah, that's the goal.
Right. Easy to forget that GP2 still plays. Easy to forget the playoffs 2 years ago when Gary Payton changed the Warriors, fate with some really, really clutch plays with blocks on Jokic, with really clutch steals. I think this year, hopefully, with more health, I don't know if he has any health issues. I haven't heard of any.
I haven't heard of any
season.
either.
Right. So healthy GP2. I think the Warriors have good depth this season. Out of the many in years past, reminds me the most of Strength in Numbers Warriors since Strength in Numbers.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's finish up by doing a bit of projection here. So, as I mentioned before, the West is really competitive. There are a lot of really awesome teams that we'll discuss in other podcasts that interest us and that could compete for those playoff spots.
Yeah.
But based on those assets, based on how the Warriors did last season, based on the aging core, based on everything that's happening, give me like a projection for the Warriors record. I want to say that the over under. Well, we can actually check that. But what do you think that the Warriors will end up like record wise?
I think they'll end up better than last year because of the cohesion I've been seeing and the fact that their road record, I think, will be significantly better, which is going to be critical.
Okay, so sorry, just pause. 48.5 is what it currently is on Caesar Sportsbook, FanDuel, Ben, etc. So the line's about 48.5. What do you think? Over under that?
I'm going to go over at 40 and a half. I think they'll get to 50. I think they'll get to 52 is what I'd have to say. I think their road record will be better, and people are really underrating, I think, the Warriors' home court advantage. Chase Center is something else. Like, just the vibe of that arena is different than a lot of other ones, and so I feel like the home crowd pushing them forward, and Warriors Nation coming is going to give them probably one of the best home records in the league. And combined with like a 50-50 road record, that will be more than enough to push them over 50, I feel like.
And where do you think that ends up in terms of the league? Like, sorry, the Western Conference.
I think that they could be a top 5 seed. I think 5 or 4 is probably where I'd put them. I just don't think the Warriors will go for the 1, and I think Steph Curry will probably have a stint of injury at some point in time, and Draymond will have one.
Does, right?
So we'll just see. Like I'm not expecting too much, but I just wanted to. I think that our road record will be better, and I think that will catapult us because Chase Center is going to still be live. Everyone's going to love it there, so right. I still think we'll win at home.
Yeah, I think if we've learned anything in the past few years of the playoffs, it's that seeding is only so important. Obviously the Nuggets were top seed last year, but I think if you just think back to like the Lakers, for example. What matters a lot more than your win total is how you are in those last like 20 games before the season's end, how your top 7 matches up, and also I think it's really, really, really important to have those wing shooters, and that ultimately matters more to me than being like a 1 or a 2. So yeah, I would agree. I think I would take the Warriors as like a 4 or 5. I would project them probably about the line, honestly. I mean, I just think that the West is pretty competitive this year. There aren't as many nights where, like last season, I was pretty confident most nights against like non-Grizzlies, like, not the Grizzlies, not necessarily the Nuggets, but I thought the Warriors were able to handle a lot of those teams, especially at home. I think we might get more of a challenge this year.
Yeah, that's probably true.
Some of those teams are more developed, like the Timberwolves. They have, Naz Reid, the great Warriors killer.
Yeah.
Players like that exist now, right? And I think that could present more problems, but 50 wins can still be a title team. I don't think that the Warriors need to be that concerned about that type of output.
Absolutely.
All right, well, that'll do it for us. That's our Warriors preseason assessment, preseason preview. We'll be back probably 1-2 more times before the Warriors actually start the season, to just discuss the slate of games. We're back. It's Dub Nation time yet again. We got to discuss the first 10-20 games. We're going to be without Draymond Green. A lot of things are going to happen, so we'll be there to discuss that. We'll be back to also discuss how the rest of the NBA stacks up. There are a lot of really interesting teams that I want to discuss, and all of these things in the next few weeks before the season kicks off.